Okay, so this is the video cast for historical background of Canada. So we are going to focus on looking at some major dates in Canadian history. Now, in order to really understand Canada, I think there are three relationships we need to talk about. We need to talk about the parent-child relationship between Great Britain and Canada. We need to talk about the big brother relationship between the United States and Canada, where the United States is the big brother, Canada is the youngest sibling who sometimes gets spoiled by the parents, and then relationships between the French and English, a rocky marriage. And basically these three relationships shape Canada as we're moving into looking at Canada's role and in World War I and the impact of Canada in World War I. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the map of Canada. As you notice, this is what Canada was for a long, long time. And then in the late 1800s, they added Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And later, Alberta and British Columbia. In 1861, there was a train that went all the way from Newfoundland all the way through to British Columbia. Now, up until this point, though, starting in 1760, when Great Britain took control, most of this was pretty sparsely settled, and it was not all one colony. They were separate little colonies that all had relationships with the United States, very similar to the way the United States was early on in its history. So, we're going to do a timeline lecture here. The first thing that we need to talk about is 1760, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ended on Canadian soil. French ceded all of its territories in North America. Actually, the French leader basically said, "Why should we be sad? We only lost a few acres of snow." And so basically they turned over their part of Canada to the English. Well, even though it's sparsely settled, there was a community of French speakers in Canada. Now, people started immigrating from the United States, started immigrating from Great Britain and other colonies into Canada, and began basically two distinct groups, the French and the Canadians. So that leads us into the 1774 Quebec Act, and this is really one of the first acts that really talk about this relationship, the rocky marriage between the French Canadians and the English Canadians. The Quebec Act legalized the tolerance that the French had received. Basically, they made their system of land ownership, which really is deeply rooted in their Catholic faith. The Catholic Church became legal, and the legal code of the Catholic Church was the current legal code of Quebec. Respected the French language and gave Quebec freedom, gave Quebec freedom to educate their own people, to keep their language and all of these things, because they just expected that over time the French would lose their language, lose their distinctness, and become more and more English. The American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution is important because basically the Americans tried to invade Canada. This is the first time. The French Canadians fight for Great Britain and basically fight off the Americans. Well, then in the War of 1812, the Americans tried to invade Canada again. And the French Canadians then also helped defend Quebec and Canada from the Americans. Then we come to 1855, the Reciprocity Treaty with the U.S. This created free trade on timber and other primary goods. Although still run by Britain, Canada played a major role in the treaty, and the U.S. only wanted the treaty on road to taking over Canada. The U.S., basically people in the U.S. argued that they didn't want necessarily this treaty, or they didn't want to have kind of free trade with Canada, but they just assumed they would take over Canada as part of what they were doing. So basically this is the first kind of treaty between Canada and the United States, where Canada would have, the United States would get rid of the tariffs on primary goods that Canada would send to the United States, and then Canada would drop its tariffs on any manufactured goods coming back to Canada. 1859 is the Galt Tariff. Great Britain was trying to create free trade and gave the Dominions control of their tariff rates for foreign imports. Had a general rate of 20 to 25% on most goods. Canada wanted revenue to begin to make improvements to its infrastructure, so it did not lower the tariff towards Great Britain, but actually raised it, which kind of angered Great Britain and created kind of a rocky relationship between the two. They also tended to, anything that wasn't covered by the 1855 Reciprocity Treaty with the United States, they raised. So basically, they were giving the United States better trade rights and better trade rules than they were giving to Great Britain. So 1867, we have the British North American Act. And this is important, but it actually ties in with the U.S. Civil War. So the U.S. Civil War in 1866 ended, and basically what happened is you have over 5 million men in the Union Army. I think maybe even 6 million. There are 3 million people in all of Canada. And so what Great Britain was afraid of was that the United States would just take that army, turn north, and conquer Canada. So the British North American Act then is in response to this fear that the U.S. would try and take over Canada. And so basically what it was is several things I want to talk about it. It becomes the Constitution of Canada until 1982. One of the major issues is that it clearly sets up division of powers between the provinces and the central government. And that becomes an issue for Canada throughout its history, is because the national government has all the power to collect the money, but all the social power to regulate education and all the social issues is actually provincial. So 4 provinces were united by a confederation that gave power to a national government in Ottawa and provincial governments in each province. Basically, they set up a constitutional monarchy very similar to what was going on in Great Britain. So there was a monarch, and that was the Queen. And the Queen would send a representative over to Canada. And then a bicameral legislature. Basically, it was the House of Commons and like a House of Lords, or they called it the Senate. And there, those people were appointed by the Queen. But the House of Commons, or the House of Commons, was elected by the people. Quebec gets 65 seats, which gave them quite a bit of an advantage over the other provinces, but it's basically you get an MP per your population, but Quebec always got 65 seats, which gave them some power and meant that people had to deal with Quebec, the French province, in order to do that. So in Quebec, it was mainly dominated by French people. There were English people that lived there, but it was dominated by the French. And Quebec becomes kind of the center of this rocky marriage between the English and the French. All right, 1870 Manitoba Act. This is where we get into some issues. So the Manitoba Act forced the Métis, which were French-speaking natives or mixed race people with the First Nations of Canada and the French, to give up their land in the Red River. French-speaking mixed bloods felt that they were treated poorly by the British. Quite a story, though. So the mixed blood groups had a settlement in their land owned by the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company sold out. England wanted Canada to buy that land from the Hudson Bay Company, so Canada would have that land. Canada was given that land, and then basically did not deal with the Métis. So the Métis organized a provisional government, then tried to negotiate their addition to Canada. It might have worked given the Canadian government, if the Canadian government hadn't bungled the whole issue. So Riel, this guy by the name of Riel, and other leaders executed a Canadian prisoner who was just a jerk. But anyway, they executed him, and so that meant Canada felt like they couldn't deal with them. And so after the Manitoba Act, they were considered outlaws. Now, this was a problem between the French-speaking and the English-speaking, because here you've got the French-speaking Métis who are being outlawed and being treated poorly, where the English-speaking Métis, the English-speaking mixed-race people, were given the kind of the benefit of the doubt. So let's talk about the Riel case, just because we continue with that, and then we'll go back to 1884 with England wanting more control. So the Riel case, basically 1885 to 87, So basically Riel was living in the United States, and people asked him to come back. Land promised the Métis was bought by speculators, and the government was treating them poorly again. So they went to Riel again and asked him, could he start a peaceful protest? And Riel tried the same tactics as before, where he tried to organize the Métis around a group of property, try to create a country, and come back. Most of the settlers, but he did not have the support of most of the settlers this time, and so after getting into an armed conflict with Canadian police, he was arrested and tried under treason. Now, he was tried along with some English-speaking Métis who also rebelled and fought with the Canadian police, but they were not executed. They were put in prison, and Riel was executed. And this creates, basically, Riel becomes a martyr for the French cause. He becomes a martyr for the French, and so the French feel like that they are being singled out, that they are not being treated fairly, and so this begins an issue between them. To go back to, so in 1884, England wanted more control over its provinces. And this begins this issue in Canada where basically there are people that emigrate straight from Great Britain and other English-speaking that feel like they're still part of Great Britain and want to be a part of Great Britain, do whatever Great Britain says. There's a group of Canadians who have been in Canada longer, born in Canada, English-speaking and French-speaking, who feel like they need to make sure that they keep some distance from England. People in Canada wanted to keep close ties with Great Britain, but they did not want them to interfere in the government of Canada. And so a lot of people really wanted Canada to have its own control. All right, 1897. The addition of Alberta and Saskatchewan brings up a big issue. Now, one of the things that's missing on this this podcast so far, or videocast, is the 1890 Manitoba abolishes public funding for Catholic schools. So Manitoba was a new province, and basically in Manitoba they had negotiated this idea that they would allow for some public funding for Catholic schools and allow the French. Well, Manitoba abolishes the public funding for Catholic schools and only allows, so that way, if the French wanted their own, and then only public schools could speak English. And so if the French wanted their own schools, they had to now pay for them, and they became private schools. And they had to fund them themselves. And this created an issue in the marriage that was really, in this rocky marriage, that's really hard to solve. This gets continued in 1897 with the addition of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Would they have public schools? So they brought the school issue back. The French wanted guaranteed rights to have separate schools. They create kind of a handshake agreement that later the English go back on. And so they're the only place eventually French public schools can be is in Quebec. But we'll continue on this. But this, again, after the Riel case, you see these other two things that happen that basically create a real rift between the French and the English-speaking Canadians. So let me put this back up here. And so we're going to go back and put all these up. So we've got a couple more things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Boer War. Now, the only reason... in 1898, which is not on your timeline there, they entered into a reciprocal trade agreement with Britain and the U.S., which gave Canada market for its primary goods, and they would buy manufactured goods from the United States and Britain. This was hotly contested in both countries, but eventually Canada did this. Now, this was a mistake for Canada. Canada was beginning to have some industrial growth, and by allowing both Britain and the U.S. to sell manufactured goods in Canada cheaper than they could produce it, it kind of stalled that industrial growth. 1899, the Boer War. Great Britain was fighting a war in South Africa against the Dutch-speaking minority that were part of this country. Now, the Dutch-speaking minority were there first. The British came and conquered the area. Then the British government was there, and they basically started kind of pushing back on the Dutch-speaking people of South Africa, and so they fought back. Canada was asking, or Great Britain was asking for the provinces, or the provinces are supposed to send troops when Great Britain is at war. Well, Canada had a French-speaking premier at the time, or prime minister, called Laurier. And Laurier did not want to send Canadian troops because this is causing a huge issue between the imperialists and the anti-imperialists. Now, the imperialists in Canadian history are those that believe that they should be close to Great Britain and do whatever Great Britain says. The anti-imperialists, which includes both English and French-speaking Canadians, feel like Canada should rule over itself, that Canada should make decisions best for itself. So Laurier compromises by allowing volunteers to go and fight in the Boer War, but never do they raise a group of people. And that brings us to the last thing, and I know I'm going a little bit over the 15 minutes, but the 1910 Naval Service Act is another kind of extension of this, where Laurier wanted Canada to have its own navy rather than give money to Great Britain. Great Britain is in a contest with Germany right now to build the most battleships. And so they're asking money from Australia, from South Africa, from Canada, from India to build more ships. Well, basically, Laurier says, no, we're going to build our own navy, and then we will lend it to you whenever you want it. Well, this basically gets made fun of. It's called Laurier's Tin Pot Navy. And basically, it's at the center of the debate between the imperialists and anti-imperialists. And basically, because of this, Laurier loses the 1910 or 1911 elections to Borden, as Quebec abandons him, feeling like he's giving in to Great Britain too much, and felt Borden. And so they went with Borden, as they felt Borden would seek more independence from Britain. Basically, Borden, though, tried to give the $35 million to Britain to build their ship, but it was defeated by the Senate, and so Canada never did give money or build its own ships as part of this. So we will continue this with the Regulation 17 and 1912 in class, but I hope you had a great break, and I'm looking forward to looking at Canada's role in World War I.